Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely mind-bending historical mystery. I want you to imagine a world totally untouched by modern civilization, just vast, wild, and unpredictable. We're looking at a real ancient tribe, a group of actual people who vanished thousands of years ago, leaving only the absolute faintest traces behind in the dirt. We're going to sift through the buried clues they left behind and try to piece together a massive puzzle that has literally baffled researchers for decades.
Just picture it for a second. An entire community living thousands of years ago. They survived incredibly harsh environments, they gathered their food, they raised their families, and they built a life together against basically impossible odds. You can almost see their fires burning bright against the prehistoric night. And then, well, suddenly their traces just begin to disappear from the archaeological record. It completely vanishes, and that prompts the ultimate cold case detective question. What on earth actually happened to them? Let's dig into the evidence and try to find out. Section 1. Who were they? The forgotten hunter-gatherers.
Okay, so let's first establish exactly who the victims of our mystery were, because it's important to remember these weren't fictional characters in a movie, right? They were real, breathing ancient humans living in an incredibly demanding time period. They functioned as a highly coordinated, tight-knit community. To survive, they had to work together to hunt and gather in the wild. We're talking about burning upwards of 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day just to secure a single meal in freezing temperatures. They also crafted intricate stone tools by hand, a process called knapping that took incredible precision and a deep knowledge of the local geography just to find the right flint. They protected each other, they passed down generational knowledge, and they handled all the daily chores required to keep their families alive in a totally unforgiving world.
Their whole existence was defined by just this unimaginable resilience. Think about the wild contrast of their daily lives. On one hand, you have their relatively fragile, basic shelters, stuff they built out of animal skins, mammoth bones, and whatever branches they could forge. But on the other hand, they were up against absolutely harsh, unforgiving prehistoric environments. Roaring winds, freezing nights, scorching days. These elements constantly tested the limits of their structures. They were so exposed to the elements that their daily survival was just an astonishing feat of human endurance. Honestly, most modern humans would struggle to replicate it for even a weekend.
Section 2. A world of survival, establishing the stakes. So, to understand how they might have vanished, we really need to understand the scene of the crime, so to speak. We need to look at the hostile environment that threatened their existence every single day. They were constantly adapting to a relentless onslaught of dangers. Extreme, unpredictable weather was just the start. They had the very real threat of fierce predators lurking in the brush. Massive cave lions and dire wolves that literally saw early humans as prey. Then add in the spread of deadly prehistoric diseases, this constant underlying threat of starvation, and fierce competition with other human groups for some incredibly limited resources. Back then, a simple tooth infection or a broken bone during a hunt, that could easily be a death sentence. Every day was a battle just to see tomorrow. Because they were in this highly fragile state of survival, ecological balance was absolutely everything. The slightest shift in climate, temperature, or even local geography could spell total disaster for the entire tribe. When you're living on the razor's edge like that, relying on the predictable migration of herds or the seasonal blooming of certain plants, a small disruption doesn't just mean a hard winter. It can literally threaten an entire population's existence. The margin for error was basically zero.
Section 3. Signs of disappearance, the empty scene.
Let's move over to the actual archaeological evidence and look at how researchers figured out this population was vanishing. If you look at the timeline of the Earth through the layers of sediment, it tells a wild story. Generations prior, you see a thriving community leaving very clear marks of established settlements, fire pits stuffed with charred animal bones, distinct artifacts, the works. Then, in their final years, we find their last known footprints, highly specific stone tools left right in the middle of being created, and some scattered bone fragments. And then, nothing. Centuries later, there is just this abrupt, incredibly eerie gap in the archaeological record. The Earth simply stops recording their story. No more hearths, no more tools, just empty soils stretching on for millennia.
Now, this missing evidence leads scientists to ask a really vital, kind of haunting question. Did they truly disappear? Were they wiped out entirely by some unseen catastrophe? Or did they just pack up their settlements and migrate to a new, unknown homeland, leaving their old lives completely behind?
Section 4. What could have happened? The investigation.
To solve this mystery, we've got to explore a few scientific theories that basically serve as our suspects in this disappearance. Our first major theory is a rapid climate shift. Think about a sudden drop in temperature or a drastic shift in rainfall. That could have led to a massive, devastating loss of their usual food and water sources. If an ice age suddenly expanded or a decades-long drought took hold, the landscape would have completely altered. Rivers they relied on might have dried up, forests might have turned into barren tundras, basically making their homeland completely uninhabitable and forcing them into starvation.
But what if it wasn't the weather at all? That brings us to our biological suspect. A sudden, devastating pathogen could have swept right through their camps. In science, we call this a population bottleneck via disease. For a small, closely knit, and really vulnerable population with absolutely no natural immunity to new pathogens, a highly contagious illness would dramatically slash their numbers in just a matter of weeks. The tribe could have been utterly devastated by an invisible enemy before they even had a second to understand what was happening, let alone adapt to it.
We also have to impartially weigh two competing sociological theories against each other here: conflict versus migration. On the one hand, escalating competition with neighboring human groups for prime hunting land and basic resources could have sparked a violent, prolonged conflict that ultimately wiped our tribe out entirely. On the other hand, maybe they just chose migration. They could have peacefully, or maybe out of desperate necessity, left their homeland to join, mix, and assimilate with another neighboring population. Both are highly plausible scenarios given how brutal and dynamic the ancient world was.
And the final suspect on our list is a sudden natural disaster. We are talking about catastrophic environmental events here. Massive floods wiping out valleys overnight, a sudden volcanic eruption blocking out the sun and choking the air with ash, or, again, severe unyielding droughts. An event of that magnitude could have completely destroyed their fragile settlements in the blink of an eye. It would bury their tools, their homes, and their entire history under heavy layers of mud, ash, or sand, essentially entombing them instantly.
Now, as we evaluate all these fascinating possibilities throughout this explainer, we absolutely must remember the golden rule of archaeology. We have to strictly separate confirmed archaeological evidence from scientific theories. We can't just present speculation as fact. We always have to draw a very clear, hard line between what we actually know from sifting through the dirt and what we theorize might have happened based on the gaps they left behind. Section 5. Tracing their descendants, the genetic clues.
So let's pivot to modern science and see how researchers are using genetics to hunt for clues. Did the tribe actually survive? By following a rigorous scientific process, researchers can sometimes extract ancient DNA from the very few surviving bone fragments we do have. It's actually amazing. They often rely on DNA locked deep inside the petrous bone. That's a tiny, incredibly dense part of the inner ear that perfectly preserves genetic code for millennia, way after the rest of the skeleton has turned to literal dust. They then analyze this genetic data, comparing it against later, more recent populations. This process is a total game changer because it reveals hidden human connections that physical archaeology, like stones and bones alone, just cannot find.
And this leads us to one of the most fascinating possibilities in this entire mystery. Their descendants could have survived without preserving the tribe's original identity. It's entirely possible that the people themselves didn't die out at all in some dramatic cataclysm. Instead, their unique cultural identity, their specific napping methods, and their distinct way of life might have just faded away as they merged with new, much larger groups. They could literally still survive in the bloodlines of others today, walking among us right now, even if their ancient name and culture are completely lost to time.
Section 6. The final evidence. What we know with confidence.
As we start to close the file on this historical cold case, let's lay out the strongest evidence researchers know with absolute confidence, versus the questions that still haunt us. We have confirmed evidence, right? We have traces of bones, specific stone tools, literal footprints locked in ancient mudscapes, and fragments of DNA, permanently linking them to later groups. These are incredible discoveries that fundamentally changed our understanding of ancient history. But the remaining mysteries? They're massive. The exact cause of their disappearance? Still completely unknown. The complete story of their final days? A total mystery. Where exactly the final survivors went when the last fires went out? We still have no idea. We just have to humbly acknowledge that a definitive, Hollywood ending to their story remains completely out of reach.
Section 7. The unsolved conclusion. Echoes in the dust. Circling back to our very first question of what happened to them, we have to accept that thousands of years later, their complete story may forever stay hidden in that prehistoric landscape. The elements have essentially washed away the answers. But I really want you to take away this powerful thought.
An entire human community can disappear from history, yet leave behind clues that survive for thousands of years. Even when a civilization seemingly vanishes into thin air, the tiny, resilient fragments they leave behind, a chipped stone, a fossilized footprint, a microscopic strand of DNA, they ensure they are never entirely erased from the great human story.
Their settlements might be long gone, but their echoes definitely remain. It's a haunting reality. And it leads us with one final, kind of cinematic question to ponder regarding the vast, untold secrets of our ancient world. Just how many other ancient civilizations might have vanished without leaving a clear explanation? Our Earth is vast, and human history is unimaginably long. So keep asking questions, keep looking at the evidence, and never stop wondering about the footprints left behind in the dust. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.